Chapter 6. Why don't men and women really like one another nowadays? Connie asked Tommy Dukes, who was more or less her oracle. Oh, but they do. I don't think since the human species was invented there has ever been a time when men and women have liked one another as much as they do today. Genuine liking. Take myself. I really like women better than men. They are braver. One can be more frank with them. Connie pondered this. Ah, yes, but you never have anything to do with them, she said. I? What am I doing but talking perfectly sincerely to a woman at this moment? Yes, talking. And what more could I do if you were a man than talk perfectly sincerely to you? Nothing, perhaps, but a woman wants you to like her and talk to her, and at the same time love her and desire her. And it seems to me the two things are mutually exclusive. But they shouldn't be. No doubt, water ought not to be wet as it is. Overdoes it in wetness. But there it is. I like women and talk to them, and therefore I don't love them and desire them. The two things don't happen at the same time in me. I think they ought to. All right. The fact that things ought to be something else than they are is not my department. Connie considered this. It isn't true, she said. Men can love women and talk to them. I don't see how they can love them without talking and being friendly and intimate. How can they? Well, he said, I don't know. What's the use of my generalizing? I only know my own case. I like women, but I don't desire them. I like talking to them, but talking to them, though it makes me intimate in one direction, sets me poles apart from them as far as kissing is concerned. So there you are. But don't take me as a general example. Probably I'm just a special case. One of the men who like women, but don't love women, and even hate them if they force me into a pretense of love or an entangled appearance. But doesn't it make you sad? Why should it? Not a bit. I look at Charlie May and the rest of the men who have affairs. No, I don't envy them a bit. If fate sent me a woman I wanted, well and good. Since I don't know any woman I want, and never see one, why, I presume I'm cold and really like some women very much. Do you like me? Very much. And you see, there's no question of kissing between us, is there? None at all, said Connie. But ought there to be? Why, in God's name? I like Clifford, but what would you say if I went and kissed him? But isn't there a difference? Where does it lie as far as we're concerned? We're all intelligent human beings, and the male and female business is in abeyance, just in abeyance. How would you like me to start acting up like a continental male at this moment and parading the sex thing? I should hate it. Well, then, I tell you, if I'm really a male thing at all, I never run across the female of my species. And I don't miss her. I just like women. Who's going to force me into loving, or pretending to love them, working up the sex game? No, I'm not. But isn't something wrong? You may feel it. I don't. Yes, I feel something is wrong between men and women. A woman has no glamour for a man anymore. Has a man for a woman? She pondered the other side of the question. Not much, she said truthfully. Then let's leave it all alone, and just be decent and simple like proper human beings with one another. Be damned to the artificial sex compulsion. I refuse it. Connie knew he was right, really. Yet it left her feeling so forlorn and stray. Like a chip on a dreary pond, she felt. What was the point of her or anything? It was her youth which rebelled. These men seemed so old and cold. Everything seemed old and cold, and Michaelis let one down so. He was no good. The men didn't want one. They just didn't really want a woman. Even Michaelis didn't. And the bounders, who pretended they did and started working the sex game, they were worse than ever. It was just dismal, and one had to put up with it. It was quite true. Men had no real glamour for a woman. If you could fool yourself into thinking they had, even as she had fooled herself over Michaelis, that was the best you could do. Meanwhile, you just lived on, and there was nothing to it. She understood perfectly well why people had cocktail parties and jazzed and Charlestoned till they were ready to drop. You had to take it out some way or other, your youth, or it ate you up. But what a ghastly thing, this youth. You felt as old as Methuselah, and yet the thing fizzed somehow, and it didn't let you be comfortable. A mean sort of life, and no prospect. She almost wished she had gone off with Mick and made her life one long cocktail party and jazz evening. Anyhow, that was better than just mooning yourself into the grave. On one of her bad days, she went out alone to walk in the wood, ponderously heeding nothing, not even noticing where she was. The report of a gun not far off startled and angered her. Then, as she went, she heard voices and recoiled. People. She didn't want people. But her quick ear caught another sound, and she roused. It was a child, sobbing. At once she attended. Someone was ill-treating a child. She strode, swinging down the wet drive, her sullen resentment uppermost. She felt just prepared to make a scene. Turning the corner, she saw two figures in the drive beyond her, the keeper and a little girl in a purple coat and moleskin cap, crying. "Ah, shut it up, the false little bitch," came the man's angry voice, and the child sobbed louder. Constance strode nearer with blazing eyes. The man turned and looked at her, saluting coolly, but he was pale with anger. "What's the matter? "Why is she crying?" demanded Constance, peremptory but a little breathless. A faint smile like a sneer came on the man's face. "Nay, you mun ax her," he replied callously, in broad vernacular. Connie felt as if he had hit her in the face, and she changed colour. Then she gathered her defiance and looked at him, her dark blue eyes blazing rather vaguely. "I asked you," she panted. He gave a queer little bow, lifting his hat. "You did, your ladyship," he said, then, with a return to the vernacular, "but I canna tell you." And he became a soldier, inscrutable, only pale with annoyance. Connie turned to the child, a ruddy, black-haired thing of 9 or 10. "What is it, dear? Tell me why you're crying," she said, with the conventionalized sweetness suitable. More violent sobs, self-conscious. Still more sweetness on Connie's part. "There, there, don't you cry. Tell me what they've done to you." An intense tenderness of tone. At the same time she felt in the pocket of her knitted jacket, and luckily found a 6pence. "Don't you cry, then," she said, bending in front of the child. "See what I've got for you?" Sobs, snuffles, a fist taken from a blubbered face, and a black shrewd eye cast for a second on the 6pence. Then more sobs, but subduing. "There. Tell me what's the matter. Tell me," said Connie, putting the coin into the child's chubby hand, which closed over it. It's the pussy." Shudders of subsiding sobs. "What pussy, dear?" After a silence, the shy fist, clenching on 6pence, pointed into the bramble-brake. "There." Connie looked, and there, sure enough, was a big black cat, stretched out grimly, with a bit of blood on it. "Oh," she said in repulsion. "A poacher, your ladyship," said the man satirically. She glanced at him angrily. "No wonder the child cried," she said. "If you shot it when she was there, no wonder she cried." He looked into Connie's eyes, laconic, contemptuous, not hiding his feelings, and again Connie flushed. She felt she had been making a scene. The man did not respect her. "What is your name?" she said playfully to the child. "Won't you tell me your name?" Sniffs. Then very affectedly in a piping voice, "Connie Mellors." "Connie Mellors. Well, that's a nice name. And did you come out with your daddy, and he shot a pussy?" "But it was a bad pussy." The child looked at her with bold, dark eyes of scrutiny, sizing her up, and her condolence. "I wanted to stop with my gran," said the little girl. "Did you? But where is your gran?" The child lifted an arm, pointing down the drive. "At the cottage." "At the cottage. And would you like to go back to her?" Sudden, shuddering quivers of reminiscent sobs. "Yes." "Come then, shall I take you? Shall I take you to your gran? Then your daddy can do what he has to do." She turned to the man. "It is your little girl, isn't it?" He saluted and made a slight movement of the head in affirmation. "I suppose I can take her to the cottage?" asked Connie. "If your ladyship wishes." Again he looked into her eyes with that calm, searching, detached glance. A man very much alone and on his own. "Would you like to come with me to the cottage, to your gran, dear?" The child peeped up again. "Yes," she simpered. Connie disliked her, the spoilt, false little female. Nevertheless, she wiped her face and took her hand. The keeper saluted in silence. "Good morning," said Connie. It was nearly a mile to the cottage, and Connie Senior was well read by Connie Junior by the time the gamekeeper's picturesque little home was in sight. The child was already as full to the brim with tricks as a little monkey, and so self-assured. At the cottage the door stood open, and there was a rattling heard inside. Connie lingered. The child slipped her hand and ran indoors. "Gran! Gran!" "Why, are you back already?" The grandmother had been blackleading the stove. It was Saturday morning. She came to the door in her sacking apron, a blacklead brush in her hand and a black smudge on her nose. She was a little, rather dry woman. "Why, whatever," she said, hastily wiping her arm across her face as she saw Connie standing outside. "Good morning," said Connie. "She was crying, so I brought her home." The grandmother looked around swiftly at the child. "Why, where was your dad?" The little girl clung to her grandmother's skirts and simpered. "He was there," said Connie, "but he'd shot a poaching cat, and the child was upset." "Oh, you'd no right to have bothered, Lady Chatterley, I'm sure. I'm sure it was very good of you, but you shouldn't have bothered. Why, did you ever see—" And the old woman turned to the child. "Fancy Lady Chatterley taking all that trouble over you. Why, she shouldn't have bothered." "It was no bother, just a walk," said Connie, smiling. "Why, I'm sure 'twas very kind of you, I must say. So she was crying. I knew there'd be something afore they got far. She's frightened of him, that's where 'tis. Seems he's almost a stranger to her, very stranger, and I don't think their two has hit it off very easy. He's got funny ways." Connie didn't know what to say. "Look, Gran," simpered the child. The old woman looked down at the sixpence in the little girl's hand. "And sixpence and all. Oh, your ladyship, you shouldn't. You shouldn't. Why, isn't Lady Chatterley good to you? My word, you're a lucky girl this morning." She pronounced the name, as all people did, Chatterley. "Isn't Lady Chatterley good to you?" Connie couldn't help looking at the old woman's nose, and the latter again vaguely wiped her face with the back of her wrist, but missed the smudge. Connie was moving away. "Well, thank you ever so much, Lady Chatterley, I'm sure. Say thank you to Lady Chatterley." This last to the child. "Thank you," piped the child. "There's a dear," laughed Connie, and she moved away, saying, "Good morning," heartily relieved to get away from the contact. Curious, she thought, that thin, proud man should have that little, sharp woman for a mother. And the old woman, as soon as Connie had gone, rushed to the bit of mirror in the scullery and looked at her face. Seeing it, she stamped her foot with impatience. Of course she had to catch me in my coarse apron and a dirty face. Nice idea she'd get of me. Connie went slowly home to Ragby. Home. It was a warm word to use for that great weary warren. But then it was a word that had had its day. It was somehow cancelled. All the great words, it seemed to Connie, were cancelled for her generation. Love, joy, happiness, home, father, mother, husband, all these great dynamic words were half dead now, and dying from day to day. Home was a place you lived in. Love was a thing you didn't fool yourself about. Joy was a word you applied to a good Charleston. Happiness was a term of hypocrisy used to bluff other people. A father was an individual who enjoyed his own existence. A husband was a man you lived with and kept going in spirits. As for sex, the last of the great words, it was just a cocktail term for an excitement that bucked you up for a while, then left you more raggy than ever. Frayed. It was as if the very material you were made of was cheap stuff, and was fraying out to nothing. All that really remained was a stubborn stoicism. And in that there was a certain pleasure. In the very experience of the nothingness of life, phase after phase, étape after étape, there was a certain grisly satisfaction. So that's that. Always this was the last utterance. Home, love, marriage, Michaelis. So that's that. And when one died, the last words to life would be, so that's that. Money? Perhaps one couldn't say the same there. Money one always wanted. Money, success, the bitch goddess, as Tommy Dukes persisted in calling it after Henry James. That was a permanent necessity. You couldn't spend your last sou and say, finally, so that's that. No, if you lived even another 10 minutes, you wanted a few more sous for something or other. Just to keep the business mechanically going, you needed money. You had to have it. Money you have to have. You needn't really have anything else. So that's that. Since, of course, it's not your own fault you are alive. Once you are alive, money is a necessity, and the only absolute necessity. All the rest you can get along without, at a pinch. But not money. Emphatically, that's that. She thought of Michaelis and the money she might have had with him, and even that she didn't want. She preferred the lesser amount which she helped Clifford to make by his writing. That she actually helped to make. Clifford and I, together, we make $1,200 a year out of writing, so she put it to herself. Make money, make it out of nowhere, writing it out of the thin air. The last feat to be humanly proud of. The rest, all my eye Betty Martin. So she plodded home to Clifford, to join forces with him again, to make another story out of nothingness. And a story meant money. Clifford seemed to care very much whether his stories were considered first-class literature or not. Strictly, she didn't care. Nothing in it, said her father. £1,200 last year was the retort, simple and final. If you were young, you just set your teeth and bit on and held on till the money began to flow from the invisible. It was a question of power. It was a question of will. A subtle, powerful emanation of will out of yourself brought back to you the mysterious nothingness of money, a word on a bit of paper. It was a sort of magic. Certainly it was triumph. The bitch goddess. Well, if one had to prostitute oneself, let it be to the bitch goddess. One could always despise her even while one prostituted oneself to her, which was good. Clifford, of course, had still many childish taboos and fetishes. He wanted to be thought really good, which was all cock-a-hoopy nonsense. What was really good was what actually caught on. It was no good being really good and getting left with it. It seemed as if most of the really good men just missed the bus. After all, you only lived one life, and if you missed the bus, you were just left on the pavement along with the rest of the failures. Connie was contemplating a winter in London with Clifford next winter. He and she had caught the bus all right, so they might as well ride on top for a bit and show it. The worst of it was, Clifford tended to become vague, absent, and fall into fits of vacant depression. It was the wound to his psyche coming out, but it made Connie want to scream. Oh God, if the mechanism of the consciousness itself was going to go wrong, then what was one to do? Hang it all, one did one's bit. Was one to be let down absolutely? Sometimes she wept, bitterly, but even as she wept, she was saying to herself, "Silly fool, wetting hankies," as if that would get you anywhere. Since Michaelis, she had made up her mind she wanted nothing. That seemed the simplest solution of the otherwise insoluble. She wanted nothing more than what she'd got, only she wanted to get ahead with what she'd got. Clifford, the stories, Ragby, the Lady Chatterley business, money and fame such as it was, she wanted to go ahead with it all. Love, sex, all that sort of stuff, just water ices. Lick it up and forget it. If you don't hang on to it in your mind, it's nothing. Sex especially, nothing. Make up your mind to it, and you've solved the problem. Sex and a cocktail, they both lasted about as long and had the same effect, and amounted to about the same thing. But a child, a baby, that was still one of the sensations. She would venture very gingerly on that experiment. There was the man to consider, and it was curious. There wasn't a man in the world whose children you wanted. Mixed children, repulsive thought. As lief have a child to a rabbit. Tommy Dukes? He was very nice, but somehow you couldn't associate him with the baby, another generation. He ended in himself. And out of all the rest of Clifford's pretty wide acquaintance, there was not a man who did not rouse her contempt when she thought of having a child by him. There were several who would have been quite possible as lover, even Mick, but to let them breed a child on you, ugh, humiliation and abomination. So that was that. Nevertheless, Connie had the child at the back of her mind. Wait. She would sift the generations of men through her sieve and see if she couldn't find one who would do. Go ye into the streets and byways of Jerusalem and see if you can find a man. It had been impossible to find a man in the Jerusalem of the prophet, though there were thousands of male humans. But a man, c'est une autre chose. She had an idea that he would have to be a foreigner, not an Englishman, still less an Irishman, a real foreigner. But wait. Next winter she would get Clifford to London. The following winter she would get him abroad to the south of France, Italy. Wait. She was in no hurry about the child. That was her own private affair, and the one point on which, in her queer female way, she was serious to the bottom of her soul. She was not going to risk any chance comer, not she. One might take a lover almost at any moment, but a man who should beget a child on one. Wait. It's a very different matter. Go ye into the streets and byways of Jerusalem. It was not a question of love. It was a question of a man. Why, one might even rather hate him personally, yet if he was the man, what would one's personal hate matter? This business concerned another part of oneself. It had rained, as usual, and the paths were too sodden for Clifford's chair, but Connie would go out. She went out alone every day now, mostly in the wood, where she was really alone. She saw nobody there. This day, however, Clifford wanted to send a message to the keeper, and as the boy was laid up with influenza, somebody always seemed to have influenza at Ragby, Connie said she would call at the cottage. The air was soft and dead, as if all the world were slowly dying. Grey and clammy and silent, even from the shuffling of the collieries, for the pits were working short time, and today they were stopped altogether. The end of all things. In the wood all was utterly inert and motionless. Only great drops fell from the bare boughs with a hollow little crash. For the rest, among the old trees was depth within depth of grey, hopeless inertia, silence, nothingness. Connie walked dimly on. From the old wood came an ancient melancholy, somehow soothing to her, better than the harsh insentience of the outer world. She liked the inwardness of the remnant of forest, the unspeaking reticence of the old trees. They seemed a very power of silence, and yet a vital presence. They, too, were waiting. Obstinately, stoically waiting, and giving off a potency of silence. Perhaps they were only waiting for the end, to be cut down cleared away, the end of the forest, for them the end of all things. But perhaps their strong and aristocratic silence, the silence of strong trees, meant something else. As she came out of the wood on the north side, the keeper's cottage, a rather dark brown stone cottage with gables and a handsome chimney, looked uninhabited. It was so silent and alone. But a thread of smoke rose from the chimney, and the little railed-in garden in the front of the house was dug and kept very tidy. The door was shut. Now she was here, she felt a little shy of the man with his curious, far-seeing eyes. She did not like bringing him orders, and felt like going away again. She knocked softly. No one came. She knocked again, but still not loudly. There was no answer. She peeped through the window and saw the dark little room with its almost sinister privacy, not wanting to be invaded. She stood and listened, and it seemed to her she heard sounds from the back of the cottage. Having failed to make herself heard, her mettle was roused. She would not be defeated. So she went round the side of the house. At the back of the cottage the land rose steeply, so the backyard was sunken and enclosed by a low stone wall. She turned the corner of the house and stopped. In the little yard, 2 paces beyond her, the man was washing himself, utterly unaware. He was naked to the hips, his velveteen breeches slipping down over his slender loins, and his white, slim back was curved over a big bowl of soapy water, in which he ducked his head, shaking his head with a queer little motion, lifting his slender white arms and pressing the soapy water from his ears, quick, subtle as a weasel playing with water, and utterly alone. Connie backed away round the corner of the house and hurried away to the wood. In spite of herself, she had had a shock. After all, merely a man washing himself, commonplace enough, heaven knows. Yet, in some curious way, it was a visionary experience. It had hit her in the middle of the body. She saw the clumsy breeches slipping down over the pure, delicate white loins, the bones showing a little, and the sense of aloneness, of a creature purely alone, overwhelmed her. Perfect white, solitary nudity of a creature that lives alone and inwardly alone. And beyond that, a certain beauty of a pure creature. Not the stuff of beauty, not even the body of beauty, but a lambency, the warm white flame of a single life, revealing itself in contours that one might touch. A body. Connie had received the shock of vision in her womb, and she knew it. It lay inside her. But with her mind, she was inclined to ridicule a man washing himself in a backyard, no doubt with evil-smelling yellow soap. She was rather annoyed. Why should she be made to stumble on these vulgar privacies? So she walked away from herself, but after a while she sat down on a stump. She was too confused to think. But in the coil of her confusion she was determined to deliver her message to the fellow. She would not be balked. She must give him time to dress himself, but not time to go out. He was probably preparing to go out somewhere. So she sauntered slowly back, listening. As she came near, the cottage looked just the same. A dog barked, and she knocked at the door, her heart beating in spite of herself. She heard the man coming lightly downstairs. He opened the door quickly and startled her. He looked uneasy himself, but instantly a laugh came on his face. "Lady Chatterley," he said, "will you come in?" His manner was so perfectly easy and good. She stepped over the threshold into the rather dreary little room. "I only called with a message from Sir Clifford," she said in her soft, rather breathless voice. The man was looking at her with those blue, all-seeing eyes of his, which made her turn her face aside a little. He thought her comely, almost beautiful in her shyness, and he took command of the situation himself at once. "Would you care to sit down?" he asked, presuming she would not. The door stood open. "No, thanks. Sir Clifford wondered if you would," and she delivered her message, looking unconsciously into his eyes again. And now his eyes looked warm and kind, particularly to a woman, wonderfully warm and kind and at ease. "Very good, your ladyship. I will see to it at once." Taking an order, his whole self had changed, glazed over with a sort of hardness and distance. Connie hesitated. She ought to go. But she looked round the clean, tidy, rather dreary little sitting-room with something like dismay. "Do you live here quite alone?" she asked. "Quite alone, your ladyship." "But your mother?" "She lives in her own cottage in the village." "With the child?" asked Connie. "With the child." And his plain, rather worn face took on an indefinable look of derision. It was a face that changed all the time. Baffling. "No," he said, seeing Connie stand at a loss. "My mother comes and cleans up for me on Saturdays. I do the rest myself." Again Connie looked at him. His eyes were smiling again, a little mockingly, but warm and blue and somehow kind. She wondered at him. He was in trousers and flannel shirt and a grey tie, his hair soft and damp, his face rather pale and worn-looking. When the eyes ceased to laugh, they looked as if they had suffered a great deal, still without losing their warmth. But a pallor of isolation came over him. She was not really there for him. She wanted to say so many things, and she said nothing. Only she looked up at him again and remarked, "I hope I didn't disturb you." The faint smile of mockery narrowed his eyes. "Only combing my hair, if you don't mind. I'm sorry I hadn't a coat on, but then I had no idea who was knocking. Nobody knocks here, and the unexpected sounds ominous." He went in front of her down the garden path to hold the gate. In his shirt, without the clumsy velveteen coat, she saw again how slender he was. Thin, stooping a little. Yet, as she passed him, there was something young and bright in his fair hair and his quick eyes. He would be a man about 37 or 8. She plodded on into the wood, knowing he was looking after her. He upset her so much in spite of herself. And he, as he went indoors, was thinking, she's nice. She's real. She's nicer than she knows. She wondered very much about him. He seemed so unlike a gamekeeper, so unlike a working man anyhow, although he had something in common with the local people, but also something very uncommon. The gamekeeper, Malors, is a curious kind of person, she said to Clifford. He might almost be a gentleman. Might he? Said Clifford. I hadn't noticed. But isn't there something special about him? Connie insisted. I think he's quite a nice fellow, but I know very little about him. He only came out of the army last year, less than a year ago. From India, I rather think. He may have picked up certain tricks out there. Perhaps he was an officer's servant and improved on his position. Some of the men were like that. But it does them no good. They have to fall back on their old places when they get home again. Connie gazed at Clifford contemplatively. She saw in him the peculiar tight rebuff against any one of the lower classes who might be really climbing up, which she knew was characteristic of his breed. But don't you think there is something special about him? She asked. Frankly, no. Nothing I had noticed. He looked at her curiously, uneasily, half suspiciously. And she felt he wasn't telling her the real truth. He wasn't telling himself the real truth. That was it. He disliked any suggestion of a really exceptional human being. People must be more or less at his level or below it. Connie felt again the tightness, niggardliness of the men of her generation. They were so tight, so scared of life. Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence, Chapter 7. When Connie went up to her bedroom, she did what she had not done for a long time. Took off all her clothes and looked at herself naked in the huge mirror. She did not know what she was looking for or at very definitively, yet she moved the lamp till it shone full on her. And she thought, as she had thought so often, what a frail, easily hurt, rather pathetic thing a human body is, naked. Somehow a little unfinished, incomplete. She had been supposed to have rather a good figure, but now she was out of fashion, a little too female, not enough like an adolescent boy. She was not very tall, a bit Scottish and short. But she had a certain fluent, down-slipping grace that might have been beauty. Her skin was faintly tawny, her limbs had a certain stillness. Her body should have had a full, down-slipping richness, but it lacked something. Instead of ripening its firm, down-running curves, her body was flattening and going a little harsh. It was as if it had not had enough sun and warmth. It was a little grayish and sapless. Disappointed of its real womanhood, it had not succeeded in becoming boyish and unsubstantial and transparent. Instead, it had gone opaque. Her breasts were rather small and dropping pear-shaped, but they were unripe, a little bitter, without meaning hanging there, and her belly had lost the fresh round gleam it had had when she was young, in the days of her German boy, who really loved her physically. Then it was young and expectant, with a real look of its own. Now it was going slack and a little flat, thinner but with a slack thinness. Her thighs, too, they used to look so quick and glimpsy in their female roundness. Somehow they, too, were going flat, slack, meaningless. Her body was going meaningless, going dull and opaque. So much insignificant substance. It made her feel immensely depressed and hopeless. What hope was there? She was old at 27, with no gleam and sparkle in the flesh. Old through neglect and denial. Yes, denial. Fashionable women kept their bodies bright like delicate porcelain by external attention. There was nothing inside the porcelain, but she was not even as bright as that. The mental life. Suddenly she hated it with a rushing fury. The swindle! She looked in the other mirror's reflection at her back, her waist, her loins. She was getting thinner, but to her it was not becoming. The crumple of her waist at the back, as she bent back to look, was a little weary. And it used to be so gay-looking. And the longish slope of her haunches and her buttocks had lost its gleam and its sense of richness. Gone. Only the German boy had loved it. And he was 10 years dead, very nearly. How time went by. 10 years dead, and she was only 27. The healthy boy with his fresh, clumsy sensuality that she had then been so scornful of. Where would she find it now? It was gone out of men. They had their pathetic 2 seconds spasms like Michaela's, but no healthy human sensuality that warms the blood and freshens the whole being. Still, she thought the most beautiful part of her was the long sloping fall of the haunches from the socket of the back, and the slumberous round stillness of the buttocks. Like hillocks of sand, the Arabs say, soft and downward slipping with a long slope. Here the life still lingered, hoping. But here too she was thinner and going unripe, astringent. But the front of her body made her miserable. It was already beginning to slacken with a slack sort of thinness, almost withered, going old before it had ever really lived. She thought of the child she might somehow bear. Was she fit, anyhow? She slipped into her nightdress and went to bed, where she sobbed bitterly. And in her bitterness burned a cold indignation against Clifford and his writings and his talk, against all the men of his sort who defrauded a woman even of her own body. Unjust, unjust! The sense of deep physical injustice burned to her very soul. But in the morning, all the same, she was up at 7 and going downstairs to Clifford. She had to help him in all the intimate things, for he had no man and refused a woman servant. The housekeeper's husband, who had known him as a boy, helped him and did any heavy lifting, but Connie did the personal things, and she did them willingly. It was a demand on her, but she had wanted to do what she could. So she hardly ever went away from Ragby, and never for more than a day or two, when Mrs. Betts, the housekeeper, attended to Clifford. He, as was inevitable in the course of time, took all the service for granted. It was natural he should. And yet, deep inside herself, a sense of injustice, of being defrauded, had begun to burn in Connie. The physical sense of injustice is a dangerous feeling once it is awakened. It must have outlet, or it eats away the one in whom it is aroused. Poor Clifford, he was not to blame. His was the greater misfortune. It was all part of the general catastrophe. And yet, was he not in some way to blame? This lack of warmth, this lack of the simple, warm, physical contact, was he not to blame for that? He was never really warm, nor even kind, only thoughtful, considerate in a well-bred, cold sort of way. But never warm as a man can be warm to a woman, as even Connie's father could be warm to her, with the warmth of a man who did himself well, and intended to, but who still could comfort a woman with a bit of his masculine glow. But Clifford was not like that. His whole race was not like that. They were all inwardly hard and separate, and warmth to them was just bad taste. You had to get on without it, and hold your own, which was all very well if you were of the same class and race. Then you could keep yourself cold and be very estimable, and hold your own, and enjoy the satisfaction of holding it. But if you were of another class and another race, it wouldn't do. There was no fun merely holding your own and feeling you belonged to the ruling class. What was the point when even the smartest aristocrats had really nothing positive of their own to hold, and their rule was really a farce, not rule at all? What was the point? It was all cold nonsense. A sense of rebellion smoldered in Connie. What was the good of it all? What was the good of her sacrifice, her devoting her life to Clifford? What was she serving, after all? A cold spirit of vanity that had no warm human contacts, and that was as corrupt as any low-born Jew in craving for prostitution to the bitch goddess Success. Even Clifford's cool and contactless assurance that he belonged to the ruling class didn't prevent his tongue lolling out of his mouth as he panted after the bitch goddess. After all, Michaelis was really more dignified in the matter and far, far more successful. Really, if you looked closely at Clifford, he was a buffoon, and a buffoon is more humiliating than a bounder. As between the two men, Michaelis really had far more use for her than Clifford had. He had even more need of her. Any good nurse can attend to crippled legs. And as for the heroic effort, Michaelis was a heroic rat, and Clifford was very much of a poodle showing off. There were people staying in the house, among them Clifford's Aunt Eva, Lady Bennerley. She was a thin woman of 60, with a red nose, a widow, and still something of a grande dame. She belonged to one of the best families, and had the character to carry it off. Connie liked her. She was so perfectly simple and frank, as far as she intended to be frank, and superficially kind. Inside herself she was a past mistress in holding her own, and holding other people a little lower. She was not at all a snob, far too sure of herself. She was perfect at the social sport of coolly holding her own and making other people defer to her. She was kind to Connie, and tried to worm into her woman's soul with the sharp gimlet of her well-born observations. "You're quite wonderful, in my opinion," she said to Connie. "You've done wonders for Clifford. I never saw any budding genius myself, and there he is, all the rage." Aunt Eva was quite complacently proud of Clifford's success. Another feather in the family cap. She didn't care a straw about his books, but why should she? "Oh, I don't think it's my doing," said Connie. "It must be. Can't be anybody else's, and it seems to me you don't get enough out of it." "How?" "Look at the way you are shut up here. I said to Clifford, if that child rebels one day, you'll have yourself to thank." "But Clifford never denies me anything," said Connie. "Look here, my dear child," and Lady Bennerley laid her thin hand on Connie's arm. "A woman has to live her life, or live to repent not having lived it. Believe me." And she took another sip of brandy, which maybe was her form of repentance. "But I do live my life, don't I?" "Not in my idea. Clifford should bring you to London and let you go about. His sort of friends are all right for him, but what are they for you? And if I were you, I should think it wasn't good enough. You'll let your youth slip by, and you'll spend your old age, and your middle age, too, repenting it." Her ladyship lapsed into contemplative silence, soothed by the brandy. But Connie was not keen on going to London, and being steered into the smart world by Lady Bennerley. She didn't feel really smart. It wasn't interesting. And she did feel the peculiar, withering coldness under it all, like the soil of Labrador, with its gay little flowers on its surface, and a foot down is frozen. Tommy Dukes was at Ragby, and another man, Harry Winterslow, and Jack Strangeways with his wife Olive. The talk was much more desultory than when only the cronies were there, and everybody was a bit bored, for the weather was bad, and there was only billiards and the pianola to dance to. Olive was reading a book about the future, when babies would be bred in bottles and women would be immunized. "Jolly good thing, too," she said. "Then a woman can live her own life." Strangeways wanted children, and she didn't. "How do you like to be immunized?" Winterslow asked her with an ugly smile. "I hope I am, naturally," she said. "Anyhow, the future's going to have more sense, and a woman needn't be dragged down by her functions." Perhaps she'll float off into space altogether, said Dukes. I do think sufficient civilization ought to eliminate a lot of the physical disabilities, said Clifford. All the love business, for example, it might just as well go. I suppose it would if we could breed babies in bottles. No, cried Olive, that might leave all the more room for fun. I suppose, said Lady Bennerley contemplatively, if the love business went, something else would take its place. Morphia, perhaps. A little morphine in all the air. It would be wonderfully refreshing for everybody. The government releasing ether into the air on Saturdays for a cheerful weekend, said Jack. Sounds all right, but where should we be by Wednesday? So long as you can forget your body, you are happy, said Lady Bennerley, and the moment you begin to be aware of your body, you are wretched. So if civilization is any good, it has to help us forget our bodies, and then time passes happily without our knowing it. Help us to get rid of our bodies altogether, said Winterslow. It's quite time man began to improve on his own nature, especially the physical side of it. Imagine if we floated like tobacco smoke, said Connie. It won't happen, said Dukes. Our old show will come flop. Our civilization is going to fall. It's going down the bottomless pit, down the chasm, and believe me, the only bridge across the chasm will be the phallus. Oh, do be impossible, General, cried Olive. I believe our civilization is going to collapse, said Aunt Eva. And what will come after it? Asked Clifford. I haven't the faintest idea, but something, I suppose, said the elderly lady. Connie says people like wisps of smoke, and Olive says immunized women and babies in bottles, and Dukes says the phallus is the bridge to what comes next. I wonder what it will really be, said Clifford. Oh, don't bother. Let's get on with today, said Olive. Only hurry up with the breeding bottle and let us poor women off. There might even be real men in the next phase, said Tommy. Real, intelligent, wholesome men. And wholesome, nice women. Wouldn't that be a change? An enormous change from us? We're not men, and the women aren't women. We're only celebrating makeshifts, mechanical and intellectual experiments. There may even come a civilization of genuine men and women instead of our little lot of clever jacks, all at the intelligence age of 7. It would be even more amazing than men of smoke or babies in bottles. Oh, when people begin to talk about real women, I give up, said Olive. Certainly nothing but the spirit in us is worth having, said Winterslow. Spirits, said Jack, drinking his whiskey and soda. Think so? Give me the resurrection of the body, said Dukes. But it'll come, in time, when we've shoved the cerebral stone away a bit, the money and the rest. Then we'll get a democracy of touch instead of a democracy of pocket. Something echoed inside Connie. Give me the democracy of touch, the resurrection of the body. She didn't at all know what it meant, but it comforted her, as meaningless things may do. Anyhow, everything was terribly silly, and she was exasperatedly bored by it all, by Clifford, by Aunt Eva, by Olive and Jack, and Winterslow, and even by Dukes. Talk, talk, talk. What hell it was, the continual rattle of it. Then, when all the people went, it was no better. She continued plodding on, but exasperation and irritation had got hold of her lower body. She couldn't escape. The days seemed to grind by with curious painfulness, yet nothing happened. Only she was getting thinner. Even the housekeeper noticed it and asked her about herself. Even Tommy Dukes insisted she was not well, though she said she was all right. Only she began to be afraid of the ghastly white tombstones, that particular loathsome whiteness of Carrara marble, detestable as false teeth, which stuck up on the hillside under Tevershall Church, and which she saw with such grim painfulness from the park. The bristling of the hideous false teeth of tombstones on the hill affected her with a grisly kind of horror. She felt the time not far off when she would be buried there, added to the ghastly host under the tombstones and the monuments in these filthy Midlands. She needed help, and she knew it. So she wrote a little cri de coeur to her sister, Hilda. "I'm not well lately, and I don't know what's the matter with me." Down posted Hilda from Scotland, where she had taken up her abode. She came in March, alone, driving herself in a nimble two-seater. Up the drive she came, tooting up the incline, then sweeping round the oval of grass where the two great wild beech trees stood, on the flat in front of the house. Connie had run out to the steps. Hilda pulled up her car, got out, and kissed her sister. "But Connie," she cried, "whatever is the matter?" "Nothing," said Connie, rather shamefacedly. But she knew how she had suffered in contrast to Hilda. Both sisters had the same rather golden, glowing skin and soft brown hair, and naturally strong, warm physique. But now Connie was thin and earthy-looking, with a scraggy, yellowish neck that stuck out of her jumper. "But you're ill, child," said Hilda, in the soft, rather breathless voice that both sisters had alike. Hilda was nearly, but not quite, 2 years older than Connie. "No, not ill. Perhaps I'm bored," said Connie a little pathetically. The light of battle glowed in Hilda's face. She was a woman, soft and still as she seemed, of the old Amazon sort, not made to fit with men. "This wretched place," she said softly, looking at poor, old, lumbering Ragby with real hate. She looked soft and warm herself, as a ripe pear, and she was an Amazon of the real old breed. She went quietly in to Clifford. He thought how handsome she looked, but also he shrank from her. His wife's family did not have his sort of manners or his sort of etiquette. He considered them rather outsiders, but once they got inside, they made him jump through the hoop. He sat square and well-groomed in his chair, his hair sleek and blonde, and his face fresh, his blue eyes pale and a little prominent, his expression inscrutable but well-bred. Hilda thought it sulky and stupid, and he waited. He had an air of a plum, but Hilda didn't care what he had an air of. She was up in arms, and if he'd been Pope or Emperor, it would have been just the same. "Connie's looking awfully unwell," she said in her soft voice, fixing him with her beautiful, glowering grey eyes. She looked so maidenly. So did Connie, but he well knew the tone of Scottish obstinacy underneath. "She's a little thinner," he said. "Haven't you done anything about it?" "Do you think it necessary?" he asked, with his suavest English stiffness, for the two things often go together. Hilda only glowered at him without replying. Repartee was not her forte, nor Connie's, so she glowered, and he was much more uncomfortable than if she had said things. "I'll take her to a doctor," said Hilda at length. "Can you suggest a good one round here?" "I'm afraid I can't." "Then I'll take her to London, where we have a doctor we trust." Though boiling with rage, Clifford said nothing. "I suppose I may as well stay the night," said Hilda, pulling off her gloves, "and I'll drive her down tomorrow." Clifford was yellow at the gills with anger, and at evening the whites of his eyes were a little yellow too. He ran to liver, but Hilda was consistently modest and maidenly. "You must have a nurse or somebody to look after you personally. You should really have a manservant," said Hilda as they sat with apparent calmness at coffee after dinner. She spoke in her soft, seemingly gentle way, but Clifford felt she was hitting him on the head with a bludgeon. "You think so?" he said coldly. "I'm sure. It's necessary. Either that or Father and I must take Connie away for some months. This can't go on." "What can't go on?" "Haven't you looked at the child?" asked Hilda, gazing at him full stare. He looked rather like a huge boiled crayfish at the moment, or so she thought. "Connie and I will discuss it," he said. "I've already discussed it with her," said Hilda. Clifford had been long enough in the hands of nurses. He hated them, because they left him no real privacy, and a manservant, he couldn't stand a man hanging round him. Almost better any woman. But why not Connie? The two sisters drove off in the morning, Connie looking rather like an Easter lamb, rather small beside Hilda, who held the wheel. Sir Malcolm was away, but the Kensington house was open. The doctor examined Connie carefully and asked her all about her life. "I see your photograph and Sir Clifford's in the illustrated papers sometimes. Almost notorieties, aren't you? That's how the quiet little girls grow up, though you're only a quiet little girl even now, in spite of the illustrated papers. No, there's nothing organically wrong, but it won't do. It won't do. Tell Sir Clifford he's got to bring you to town, or take you abroad and amuse you. You've got to be amused. Got to. Your vitality is much too low. No reserves. The nerves of the heart a bit queer already. Oh, yes, nothing but nerves. I'd put you right in a month at Cannes or Biarritz, but it mustn't go on. Mustn't, I tell you, or I won't be answerable for consequences. You're spending your life without renewing it. You've got to be amused, properly, healthily amused. You're spending your vitality without making any. Can't go on, you know. Depression. Avoid depression." Hilda set her jaw, and that meant something. Michaelis heard they were in town and came running with roses. "Why, whatever's wrong?" he cried. "You're a shadow of yourself. Why, I never saw such a change. Why ever didn't you let me know? Come to Nice with me. Come down to Sicily. Go on, come to Sicily with me. It's lovely there just now. You want sun. You want life. Why, you're wasting away. Come away with me. Come to Africa. Oh, hang Sir Clifford. Chuck him and come along with me. I'll marry you the minute he divorces you. Come along and try a life. God's love. That place, Ragby, would kill anybody. Beastly place. Foul place. Kill anybody. Come away with me into the sun. It's the sun you want, of course, and a bit of normal life." But Connie's heart simply stood still at the thought of abandoning Clifford there, and then She couldn't do it. No, she just couldn't. She had to go back to Ragby. Michaelis was disgusted. Hilda didn't like Michaelis, but she almost preferred him to Clifford. Back went the sisters to the Midlands. Hilda talked to Clifford, who still had yellow eyeballs when they got back. He, too, in his way, was overwrought, but he had to listen to all Hilda said, to all the doctor had said. Not what Michaelis had said, of course, and he sat mum through the ultimatum. Here is the address of a good manservant who was with an invalid patient of the doctor's till he died last month. He is really a good man and fairly sure to come. But I'm not an invalid, and I will not have a manservant, said Clifford, poor devil. And here are the addresses of 2 women. I saw one of them. She would do very well, a woman of about 50, quiet, strong, kind, and in her way cultured. Clifford only sulked and would not answer. Very well, Clifford, if we don't settle something by tomorrow, I shall telegraph to father, and we shall take Connie away. Will Connie go? Asked Clifford. She doesn't want to, but she knows she must. Mother died of cancer brought on by fretting. We're not running any risks. So next day Clifford suggested Mrs. Bolton, Teversham parish nurse. Apparently Mrs. Betts had thought of her. Mrs. Bolton was just retiring from her parish duties to take up private nursing jobs. Clifford had a queer dread of delivering himself into the hands of a stranger, but this Mrs. Bolton had once nursed him through scarlet fever, and he knew her. The 2 sisters at once called on Mrs. Bolton in a newish house in a row, quite select for Teversham. They found a rather good-looking woman of 40-odd in a nurse's uniform, with a white collar and apron, just making herself tea in a small crowded sitting-room. Mrs. Bolton was most attentive and polite, seemed quite nice, spoke with a bit of a broad slur, but in heavily correct English, and from having bossed the sick colliers for a good many years, had a very good opinion of herself and a fair amount of assurance. In short, in her tiny way, one of the governing class in the village, very much respected. Yes, Lady Chatterley's not looking at all well. Why, she used to be that bonny, didn't she now? But she's been failing all winter. Oh, it's hard it is, poor Sir Clifford. That war, it's a lot to answer for. And Mrs. Bolton would come to Ragby at once, if Dr. Shardlow would let her off. She had another fortnight's parish nursing to do by rights, but they might get a substitute, you know. Hilda posted off to Dr. Shardlow, and on the following Sunday Mrs. Bolton drove up in a lever's cab to Ragby with 2 trunks. Hilda had talks with her. Mrs. Bolton was ready at any moment to talk. And she seemed so young, the way the passion would flush in her rather pale cheek. She was 47. Her husband, Ted Bolton, had been killed in the pit 22 years ago, 22 years last Christmas, just at Christmas time, leaving her with 2 children, one a baby in arms. Oh, the baby was married now, Edith, to a young man in Boots Cash Chemists in Sheffield. The other one was a schoolteacher in Chesterfield. She came home weekends when she wasn't asked out somewhere. Young folks enjoyed themselves nowadays, not like when she, Ivy Bolton, was young. Ted Bolton was 28 when he was killed in an explosion down the pit. The butty in front shouted to them all to lie down quick. There were 4 of them, and they all lay down in time, only Ted, and it killed him. Then, at the inquiry, on the master's side, they said Ted had been frightened and trying to run away and not obeying orders, so it was like his fault, really. So the compensation was only £300, and they made out as if it was more of a gift than legal compensation because it was really the man's own fault. And they wouldn't let her have the money down. She wanted to have a little shop. But they said she'd no doubt squander it, perhaps in drink. So she had to draw it 30 shillings a week. Yes, she had to go every Monday morning down to the offices and stand there a couple of hours waiting her turn. Yes, for almost 4 years she went every Monday. And what could she do with 2 little children on her hands? But Ted's mother was very good to her. When the baby could toddle, she'd keep both the children for the day while she, Ivy Bolton, went to Sheffield and attended classes in ambulance, and then the 4th year she even took a nursing course and got qualified. She was determined to be independent and keep her children. So she was assistant at the Youthwaite Hospital, just a little place for a while. But when the company, the Teversham Colliery Company, really Sir Geoffrey, saw that she couldn't get on by herself, they were very good to her, gave her the parish nursing, and stood by her. She would say that for them. And she'd done it ever since, till now it was getting a bit much for her. She needed something a bit lighter. There was such a lot of traipsing around if you were a district nurse. Yes, the company's been very good to me, I always say it, but I should never forget what they said about Ted, for he was as steady and fearless a chap as ever set foot on the cage, and it was as good as branding him a coward. But there he was dead, and could say nothing to none of 'em. It was a queer mixture of feelings the woman showed as she talked. She liked the Colliers, whom she had nursed for so long, but she felt very superior to them. She felt almost upper class, and at the same time a resentment against the ruling class smouldered in her. The masters. In a dispute between masters and men, she was always for the men. But when there was no question of contest, she was pining to be superior, to be one of the upper class. The upper classes fascinated her, appealing to her peculiar English passion for superiority. She was thrilled to come to Ragby, thrilled to talk to Lady Chatterley. My word, different from the common colliers' wives. She said so in so many words. Yet one could see a grudge against the Chatterleys peep out in her, the grudge against the masters. Why, yes, of course it would wear Lady Chatterley out. It's a mercy she had a sister to come and help her. Men don't think, high and low alike. They take what a woman does for them for granted. Oh, I've told the Colliers off about it many a time, but it's very hard for Sir Clifford, you know, crippled like that. They were always a haughty family, standoffish in a way, as they've a right to be, but then to be brought down like that. And it's very hard on Lady Chatterley, perhaps harder on her. What she misses. I only had Ted 3 years, but my word, while I had him, I had a husband I could never forget. He was 1 in 1,000 and jolly as the day. Who'd ever have thought he'd get killed? I don't believe it to this day, somehow. I've never believed it, though I washed him with my own hands. But he was never dead for me. He never was. I never took it in. This was a new voice in Ragby, very new for Connie to hear. It roused a new ear in her. For the first week or so, Mrs. Bolton, however, was very quiet at Ragby. Her assured, bossy manner left her, and she was nervous. With Clifford, she was shy, almost frightened and silent. He liked that, and soon recovered his self-possession, letting her do things for him without even noticing her. "She's a useful non-entity," he said. Connie opened her eyes in wonder, but she did not contradict him. So different are impressions on 2 different people. and he soon became rather superb, somewhat lordly with the nurse. She had rather expected it, and he played up without knowing. So susceptible we are to what is expected of us. The Colliers had been so like children, talking to her and telling her what hurt them while she bandaged them or nursed them. They had always made her feel so grand, almost superhuman in her administrations. Now Clifford made her feel small, like a servant, and she accepted it without a word, adjusting herself to the upper classes. She came very mute, with her long, handsome face and downcast eyes, to administer to him. And she said very humbly, "Shall I do this now, Sir Clifford? Shall I do that?" "No, leave it for a time. I'll have it done later." "Very well, Sir Clifford." "Come in again in half an hour." "Very well, Sir Clifford. And just take those old papers out, will you?" "Very well, Sir Clifford." She went softly, and in half an hour she came softly again. She was bullied, but she didn't mind. She was experiencing the upper classes. She neither resented nor disliked Clifford. He was just part of a phenomenon, the phenomenon of the high-class folks, so far unknown to her, but now to be known. She felt more at home with Lady Chatterley, and after all, it's the mistress of the house matters most. Mrs. Bolton helped Clifford to bed at night, and slept across the passage from his room, and came if he rang for her in the night. She also helped him in the morning, and soon valeted him completely, even shaving him, in her soft, tentative woman's way. She was very good and competent, and she soon knew how to have him in her power. He wasn't so very different from the Colliers after all, when you lathered his chin and softly rubbed the bristles. The standoffishness and the lack of frankness didn't bother her. She was having a new experience. Clifford, however, inside himself, never quite forgave Connie for giving up her personal care of him to a strange hired woman. It killed, he said to himself, the real flower of the intimacy between him and her. But Connie didn't mind that. The fine flower of their intimacy was to her rather like an orchid, a bulb stuck parasitic on her tree of life, and producing to her eyes a rather shabby flower. Now she had more time to herself. She could softly play the piano up in her room and sing, "Touch not the nettle, for the bonds of love are ill to loose." She had not realized till lately how ill to loose they were, these bonds of love. But thank heaven she had loosened them. She was so glad to be alone, not always to have to talk to him. When he was alone, he tapped on a typewriter to infinity. But when he was not working, and she was there, he talked. Always talked. Infinite small analysis of people and motives and results, characters and personalities, till now she had had enough. For years she had loved it, until she had enough, and then suddenly it was too much. She was thankful to be alone. It was as if thousands and thousands of little roots and threads of consciousness in him and her had grown together into a tangled mass, till they could crowd no more, and the plant was dying. Now, quietly, subtly, she was unraveling the tangle of his consciousness and hers, breaking the threads gently, one by one, with patience and impatience to get clear. But the bonds of such love are more ill to loose, even than most bonds, though Mrs. Bolton's coming had been a great help. But he still wanted the old intimate evenings of talk with Connie, talk or reading aloud. but now she could arrange that Mrs. Bolton should come at 10 to disturb them. At 10 o'clock, Connie could go upstairs and be alone. Clifford was in good hands with Mrs. Bolton. Mrs. Bolton ate with Mrs. Betts in the housekeeper's room, since they were all agreeable, and it was curious how much closer the servants' quarters seemed to have come, right up to the doors of Clifford's study, when before they were so remote. For Mrs. Betts would sometimes sit in Mrs. Bolton's room, and Connie heard their lowered voices and felt somehow the strong other vibration of the working people almost invading the sitting-room when she and Clifford were alone. So changed was Ragby merely by Mrs. Bolton's coming, and Connie felt herself released. In another world, she breathed differently. But still she was afraid of how many of her roots, perhaps mortal ones, were tangled with Clifford's. Yet still she breathed freer. A new phase was going to begin in her life. D.H. Lawrence's Lady Chatterley's Lover, Chapter 8. Mrs. Bolton also kept a cherishing eye on Connie, feeling she must extend to her female and professional protection. She was always urging her ladyship to walk out, to drive to Youthwaite, to be in the air. For Connie had got into the habit of sitting still by the fire, pretending to read or to sew feebly, and hardly going out at all. It was a blowy day, soon after Hilda had gone, that Mrs. Bolton said, "Now why don't you go for a walk through the wood and look at the daffs behind the keeper's cottage? They're the prettiest sight you'd see in a day's march. And you could put some in your room. Wild daffs are always so cheerful-looking, aren't they?" Connie took it in good part, even daffs for daffodils. Wild daffodils. After all, one could not stew in one's own juice. The spring came back. Seasons return, but not to me returns day, or the sweet approach of eve nor morn. And the keeper, his thin white body like a lonely pistil of an invisible flower. She had forgotten him in her unspeakable depression. But now something roused, pale beyond porch and portal. The thing to do was to pass the porches and the portals. She was stronger. She could walk better, and in the wood the wind would not be so tiring as it was across the bark, flatten against her. She wanted to forget the world and all the dreadful carrion-bodied people. "Ye must be born again. I believe in the resurrection of the body. Except a grain of wheat fall into the earth and die, it shall by no means bring forth. When the crocus cometh forth, I too will emerge and see the sun." In the wind of March, endless phrases swept through her consciousness. Little gusts of sunshine blew, strangely bright, and lit up the celandines at the wood's edge, under the hazel rods. They spangled out bright and yellow. And the wood was still, stiller, but yet gusty with crossing sun. The first wildflowers were out, and all the wood seemed pale with the pallor of endless little anemones sprinkling the shaken floor. "The world has grown pale with thy breath." But it was the breath of Persephone this time. She was out of hell on a cold morning. Cold breaths of wind came, and overhead there was an anger of entangled wind caught among the twigs. It, too, was caught, and trying to tear itself free, the wind, like Absalom. How cold the anemones looked, bobbing their naked white shoulders over crinoline skirts of green. But they stood it. A few first-bleached little primroses, too, by the path, and yellow buds unfolding themselves. The roaring and swaying was overhead. Only cold currents came down below. Connie was strangely excited in the wood, and the color flew in her cheeks and burned blue in her eyes. She walked, ploddingly, picking a few primroses and the first violets that smelled sweet and cold, sweet and cold. And she drifted on without knowing where she was, till she came to the clearing at the end of the wood and saw the green, stained stone cottage, looking almost rosy, like the flesh underneath a mushroom, its stone warmed in a burst of sun. And there was a sparkle of yellow jasmine by the door, the closed door, but no sound, no smoke from the chimney, no dog barking. She went quietly round to the back, where the bank rose up. She had an excuse to see the daffodils. And they were there, the short-stemmed flowers, rustling and fluttering and shivering so bright and alive, but with nowhere to hide their faces as they turned them away from the wind. They shook their bright, sunny little rags in bouts of distress. But perhaps they liked it really. Perhaps they really liked the tossing. Constance sat down with her back to a young pine tree that swayed against her with curious life, elastic and powerful, rising up. The erect, alive thing with its top in the sun. And she watched the daffodils turn golden in a burst of sun that was warm on her hands and lap. Even she caught the faint tarry scent of the flowers, and then, being so still and alone, she seemed to bet into the current of her own proper destiny. She had been fastened by a rope, and jagging and snarling like a boat at its moorings. Now she was loose and adrift. The sunshine gave way to chill. The daffodils were in shadow, dipping silently. So they would dip through the day and the long, cold night, so strong in their frailty. She rose, a little stiff, took a few daffodils and went down. She hated breaking the flowers, but she wanted just one or two to go with her. She would have to go back to Ragby and its walls, and now she hated it, especially its thick walls. Walls, always walls. Yet one needed them in this wind. When she got home, Clifford asked her, "Where did you go?" "Right across the wood. Look, aren't the little daffodils adorable? To think they should come out of the earth." "Just as much out of air and sunshine," he said. "But modeled in the earth," she retorted, with a prompt contradiction that surprised her a little. The next afternoon she went to the wood again. She followed the broad riding that swerved round and up through the larches to a spring called John's Well. It was cold on this hillside, and not a flower in the darkness of larches. but the icy little spring softly pressed upwards from its tiny well-bed of pure reddish-white pebbles. How icy and clear it was, brilliant. The new keeper had no doubt put in fresh pebbles. She heard the faint tinkle of water as the tiny overflow trickled over and downhill. Even above the hissing boom of the larch wood that spread its bristling, leafless, wolfish darkness on the downslope, she heard the tinkle as of tiny water bells. This place was a little sinister, cold, damp. Yet the well must have been a drinking place for hundreds of years. Now no more. Its tiny cleared space was lush and cold and dismal. She rose and went slowly towards home. As she went, she heard a faint tapping away on the right and stood still to listen. Was it a hammering or a woodpecker? It was surely hammering. She walked on, listening, and then she noticed a narrow track between young fir trees, a track that seemed to lead nowhere, but she felt it had been used. She turned down it adventurously between the thick young firs which gave way soon to the old oak wood. She followed the track, and the hammering grew nearer in the silence of the windy wood, for trees make a silence, even in their noise of wind. She saw a secret little clearing and a secret hut made of rustic poles, and she had never been here before. She realized it was the quiet place where the growing pheasants were reared. The keeper, in his shirt-sleeves, was kneeling, hammering. The dog trotted forward with a short, sharp bark, and the keeper lifted his face suddenly and saw her. He had a startled look in his eyes. He straightened himself and saluted, watching her in silence as she came forward with weakening limbs. He resented the intrusion. He cherished his solitude as his only and last freedom in life. "I wondered what the hammering was," she said, feeling weak and breathless, and a little afraid of him as he looked so straight at her. "I'm getting the coops ready for the young bawds," he said in broad vernacular. She did not know what to say, and she felt weak. "I should like to sit down a bit," she said. "Come and sit here in the hut," he said, going in front of her to the hut, pushing aside some timber and stuff, and drawing out a rustic chair made of hazel sticks. "I'm ought to light you a fire?" he asked with the curious naivete of the dialect. "Oh, don't bother," she replied. But he looked at her hands. They were rather blue, so he quickly took some larch twigs to the little brick fireplace in the corner, and in a moment the yellow flame was running up the chimney. He made a place by the brick hearth. "Sit here then a bit and warm yer," he said. She obeyed him. He had that curious kind of protective authority she obeyed at once. So she sat and warmed her hands at the blaze and dropped logs on the fire, whilst outside he was hammering again. She did not really want to sit poked in a corner by the fire. She would rather have watched from the door, but she was being looked after, so she had to submit. The hut was quite cozy, panelled with unvarnished deal, having a little rustic table and stool beside her chair and a carpenter's bench, then a big box, tools, new boards, nails, and many things hung from pegs, axe, hatchet, traps, things in sacks, his coat. It had no window. The light came in through the open door. It was a jumble, but also it was a sort of little sanctuary. She listened to the tapping of the man's hammer. It was not so happy. He was oppressed. Here was a trespass on his privacy, and a dangerous one, a woman. He had reached the point where all he wanted on earth was to be alone. And yet he was powerless to preserve his privacy. He was a hired man, and these people were his masters. Especially, he did not want to come into contact with a woman again. He feared it, for he had a big wound from old contacts. He felt as if he could not be alone, and if he could not be left alone, he would die. His recoil away from the outer world was complete. His last refuge was this wood, to hide himself there. Connie grew warm by the fire, which she had made too big. Then she grew hot. She went and sat on the stool in the doorway, watching the man at work. He seemed not to notice her, but he knew. Yet he worked on, as if absorbedly, and his brown dog sat on her tail near him and surveyed the untrustworthy world. Slender, quiet, and quick, the man finished the coop he was making, turned it over, tried the sliding door, then set it aside. Then he rose, went for an old coop, and took it to the chopping log where he was working. Crouching, he tried the bars. Some broke in his hands. He began to draw the nails. Then he turned the coop over and deliberated, and he gave absolutely no sign of awareness of the woman's presence. So Connie watched him fixedly, and the same solitary aloneness she had seen in him naked, she now saw in him clothed. Solitary and intent, like an animal that works alone, but also brooding, like a soul that recoils away from all human contact. Silently, patiently, he was recoiling away from her even now. It was the stillness and the timeless sort of patience in a man impatient and passionate that touched Connie's womb. She saw it in his bent head, the quick, quiet hands, the crouching of his slender, sensitive loins, something patient and withdrawn. She felt his experience had been deeper and wider than her own, much deeper and wider, and perhaps more deadly. And this relieved her of herself. She felt almost irresponsible. So she sat in the doorway of the hut in a dream, utterly unaware of time and of particular circumstances. She was so drifted away that he glanced up at her quickly and saw the utterly still, waiting look on her face. To him, it was a look of waiting, and a thin little tongue of fire suddenly flickered in his loins at the root of his back, and he groaned in spirit. He dreaded with a repulsion almost of death any further close human contact. He wished above all things she would go away and leave him to his own privacy. He dreaded her will, her female will, and her modern female insistency. And above all, he dreaded her cool upper-class impudence of having her own way. For after all, he was only a hired man. He hated her presence there. Connie came to herself with sudden uneasiness. She rose. The afternoon was turning to evening, yet she could not go away. She went over to the man, who stood up at attention, his worn face stiff and blank, his eyes watching her. "It is so nice here, so restful," she said. "I have never been here before." "No? I think I shall come and sit here sometimes." "Yes? Do you lock the hut when you're not here? Yes, your ladyship. Do you think I could have a key, too, so that I could sit here sometimes? Are there 2 keys? Not as I know on, there isna. He had lapsed into the vernacular. Connie hesitated. He was putting up an opposition. Was it his hut, after all? Couldn't we get another key, she asked in her soft voice, that underneath had the ring of a woman determined to get her way. Another, he said, glancing at her with a flash of anger, touched with derision. Yes, a duplicate, she said, flushing. Happen Sir Clifford'd know, he said, putting her off. Yes, she said, he might have another. Otherwise we could have one made from the one you have. It would only take a day or so, I suppose. You could spare your key for so long. I canna tell yer, my lady. I know nobody as makes keys round here. Connie suddenly flushed with anger. Very well, she said, I'll see to it. All right, your ladyship. Their eyes met. His had a cold, ugly look of dislike and contempt and indifference to what would happen. Hers were hot with rebuff. But her heart sank. She saw how utterly he disliked her when she went against him, and she saw him in a sort of desperation. Good afternoon. Afternoon, my lady, he saluted and turned abruptly away. She had wakened the sleeping dogs of old voracious anger in him, anger against the self-willed female. And he was powerless. He knew it. And she was angry against the self-willed male, a servant, too. She walked sullenly home. She found Mrs. Bolton under the great beech tree on the knoll, looking for her. "I just wondered if you'd be coming, my lady," the woman said brightly. "Am I late?" asked Connie. "Oh, only Sir Clifford was waiting for his tea." "Why didn't you make it, then?" "Oh, I don't think it's hardly my place. I don't think Sir Clifford would like it at all, my lady." "I don't see why not," said Connie. She went indoors to Clifford's study, where the old brass kettle was simmering on the tray. "Am I late, Clifford?" she said, putting down the few flowers and taking up the tea-caddy as she stood before the tray in her hat and scarf. "I'm sorry. Why didn't you let Mrs. Bolton make the tea?" "I didn't think of it," he said ironically. "I don't quite see her presiding at the tea-table." "Oh, there's nothing sacrosanct about a silver teapot," said Connie. He glanced up at her curiously. "What did you do all afternoon?" he said. "Walked and sat in a sheltered place. Do you know there are still berries on the big holly tree?" She took off her scarf, but not her hat, and sat down to make tea. The toast would certainly be leathery. She put the tea-cosy over the teapot and rose to get a little glass for her violets. The poor flowers hung over, limp on their stalks. "They'll revive again," she said, putting them before him in their glass for him to smell. "Sweeter than the lids of Juno's eyes," he quoted. "I don't see a bit of connection with the actual violets," she said. "The Elizabethans are rather upholstered." She poured him his tea. "Do you think there's a second key to that little hut not far from John's Well, where the pheasants are reared?" she said. "There may be. Why?" "I happened to find it today, and I'd never seen it before. I think it's a darling place. I could sit there sometimes, couldn't I?" "Was Mellors there?" "Yes, that's how I found it, his hammering." He didn't seem to like my intruding at all. In fact, he was almost rude when I asked about a second key. What did he say? Oh, nothing, just his manner. And he said he knew nothing about keys. There may be one in Father's study. Betts knows them all. They're all there. I'll get him to look. Oh, do, she said. So Mellors was almost rude? Oh, nothing, really, but I don't think he wanted me to have the freedom of the castle quite. I don't suppose he did. Still, I don't see why he should mind. It's not his home, after all. It's not his private abode. I don't see why I shouldn't sit there if I want to. Quite, said Clifford. He thinks too much of himself, that man. Do you think he does? Oh, decidedly. He thinks he's something exceptional. You know, he had a wife he didn't get on with, so he joined up in 1915 and was sent to India, I believe. Anyhow, he was blacksmith to the cavalry in Egypt for a time. Always was connected with horses, a clever fellow that way. Then some Indian colonel took a fancy to him, and he was made a lieutenant. Yes, they gave him a commission. I believe he went back to India with his colonel and up to the northwest frontier. He was ill. He was a pension. He didn't come out of the army till last year, I believe, and then, naturally, it isn't easy for a man like that to get back to his own level. He's bound to flounder. But he does his duty all right, as far as I'm concerned, only I'm not having any of the Lieutenant Mellors' touch. How could they make him an officer when he speaks broad Derbyshire? He doesn't, except by fits and starts. He can speak perfectly well for him. I suppose he has an idea if he's come down to the ranks again, he'd better speak as the ranks speak. Why didn't you tell me about him before? Oh, I've no patience with these romances. They're the ruin of all order. It's 1,000 pities they ever happened. Connie was inclined to agree. What was the good of discontented people who fitted in nowhere? In the spell of fine weather, Clifford, too, decided to go to the wood. The wind was cold, but not so tiresome, and the sunshine was like life itself, warm and full. It's amazing, said Connie, how different one feels when there's a really fresh, fine day. Usually one feels the very air is half dead. People are killing the very air. Do you think people are doing it? He asked. I do. The steam of so much boredom and discontent and anger out of all the people just kills the vitality in the air, I'm sure of it. Perhaps some condition of the atmosphere lowers the vitality of the people, he said. No, it's man that poisons the universe, she asserted. Fouls his own nest, remarked Clifford. The chair puffed on. In the hazel copse, catkins were hanging pale gold, and in sunny places the wood anemones were wide open, as if exclaiming with the joy of life. Just as good as in past days when people could exclaim along with them. They had a faint scent of apple blossom. Connie gathered a few for Clifford. He took them and looked at them curiously. "Thou still unravished bride of quietness," he quoted. "It seems to fit flowers so much better than Greek vases." "Ravished is such a horrid word," she said. "It's only people who ravish things." "Oh, I don't know. Snails and things," he said. "Even snails only eat them, and bees don't ravish." She was angry with him, turning everything into words. Violets were Juno's eyelids, and windflowers were on ravished brides. How she hated words, always coming between her and life. They did the ravishing, if anything did. ready-made words and phrases, sucking all the life-sap out of living things. The walk with Clifford was not quite a success. Between him and Connie there was a tension that each pretended not to notice, but there it was. Suddenly, with all the force of her female instinct, she was shoving him off. She wanted to be clear of him, and especially of his consciousness, his words, his obsession with himself, his endless treadmill obsession with himself and his own words. The weather came rainy again, but after a day or two she went out in the rain and she went to the wood, and once there she went towards the hut. It was raining but not so cold, and the wood felt so silent and remote, inaccessible in the dusk of rain. She came to the clearing. No one there. The hut was locked. But she sat on the log doorstep under the rustic porch and snuggled into her own warmth. So she sat, looking at the rain, listening to the many noiseless noises of it, and to the strange soughings of wind in upper branches, when there seemed to be no wind. The old oak trees stood around, gray, powerful trunks, rain-blackened, round and vital, throwing off reckless limbs. The ground was fairly free of undergrowth. The anemones sprinkled. There was a bush or two, elder or guelder rose, and a purplish tangle of bramble. The old russet of bracken almost vanished under green anemone ruffs. Perhaps this was one of the unravished places. Unravished. The whole world was ravished. Some things can't be ravished. You can't ravish a tin of sardines. And so many women are like that, and men. But the earth. The rain was abating. It was hardly making darkness among the oaks any more. Connie wanted to go, yet she sat on. But she was getting cold. Yet the overwhelming inertia of her inner resentment kept her there as if paralyzed. Ravished. How ravished one could be without ever being touched. Ravished by dead words become obscene, and dead ideas become obsessions. A wet brown dog came running and did not bark, lifting a wet feather of a tail. The man followed in a wet black oilskin jacket like a chauffeur, and face flushed a little. She felt him recoil in his quick walk when he saw her. She stood up in the handbreadth of dryness under the rustic porch. He saluted without speaking, coming slowly near. She began to withdraw. "I'm just going," she said. "Was you waiting to get in?" he asked, looking at the hut, not at her. "No, I only sat a few minutes in the shelter," she said with quiet dignity. He looked at her. She looked cold. "Sir Clifford hadn't got no other key then?" he asked. "No, but it doesn't matter. I can sit perfectly dry under this porch. Good afternoon." She hated the excess of vernacular in his speech. He watched her closely as she was moving away. Then he hitched up his jacket and put his hand in his breeches pocket, taking out the key of the hut. "Happen you better have this key, and I'm in fin for to bud some of the road." She looked at him. "What do you mean?" she asked. "I mean, as happen I can find another place'll do for rearing the pheasants. If you want to be here, you'll not want me messing about all the time." She looked at him, getting his meaning through the fog of the dialect. "Why don't you speak ordinary English?" she said coldly. "Me? I thought it were ordinary." She was silent for a few moments in anger. "So if you want key, you'd better take it. Or happen I'd better get you tomorrow and clear all the stuff out first. Would that do for you?" "I didn't want your key," she said. "I don't want you to clear anything out at all. I don't in the least want to turn you out of your hut, thank you. I only wanted to be able to sit here sometimes, like today. But I can sit perfectly well under the porch, so please say no more about it." He looked at her again with his wicked blue eyes. "Why," he began in the broad, slow dialect, "your ladyship's as welcome as Christmas to the hut and to the key as everything as is. Only this time of the year there's bods to set, and I've got to be pottering around here a good bit, seeing after 'em, and winter time I need hardly come nigh the place. But with spring, and Sir Clifford wanting to start the pheasants, and your ladyship non want me tinkering round the place when she was here all the time." She listened with a dim kind of amazement. "Why should I mind your being here?" she asked. He looked at her curiously. "'T a nuisance on me," he said briefly but significantly. She flushed. "Very well," she said finally. "I won't trouble you, but I don't think I should have minded at all sitting and seeing you look after the birds. I should have liked it. But since you think it interferes with you, I won't disturb you. Don't be afraid. You are Sir Clifford's keeper, not mine." The phrase sounded queer. She didn't know why, but she let it pass. "Nay, your ladyship, 'tis your ladyship's own hut. It's as your ladyship likes and pleases every time. You can turn me off at a week's notice. It were only—" "Only what?" she asked, baffled. He pushed back his hat in an odd comic way. "Only as happen you'd like the place to your son when you did come, and not me messing about." "But why?" she said, angry. "Aren't you a civilized human being? Do you think I ought to be afraid of you? Why should I take any notice of you and your being here or not? Why is it important?" He looked at her, all his face glimmering with wicked laughter. "It's not your ladyship. Not in the very least," he said. "Well, why then?" she asked. "Shall I get your ladyship another key, then?" "No, thank you, I don't want it." "I'll get it anyhow. You'd best have 2 keys to the place." "And I consider you are insolent," said Connie with her colour up, panting a little. "Nay, nay," he said quickly. "Dinna you say that. Nay, nay, I never meant nothing. I only thought, as if you come here, I should have to clear out, and it'd mean a lot of work, setting up somewheres else. But if your ladyship isn't going to take no notice of me, then it's Sir Clifford's hut, and everything is as your ladyship likes. Everything is as your ladyship likes and pleases, barring you taking no notice of me, doing the bits of jobs I've got to do." Connie went away completely bewildered. She was not sure whether she had been insulted and mortally offended or not. Perhaps the man really only meant what he said, that he thought she would expect him to keep away, as if she would dream of it, and as if he could possibly be so important, he and his stupid presence. She went home in confusion, not knowing what she thought or felt.
Lady Chatterley's Lover by D.H. Lawrence. Chapter 9. Connie was surprised at her own feeling of aversion from Clifford. What is more, she felt she had always really disliked him. Not hate. There was no passion in it, but a profound physical dislike. Almost, it seemed to her, she had married him because she disliked him in a secret, physical sort of way. But of course she had married him really because in a mental way he attracted her and excited her. He had seemed, in some way, her master. beyond her. Now, the mental excitement had worn itself out and collapsed, and she was aware only of the physical aversion. It rose up in her from her depths, and she realized how it had been eating her life away. She felt weak and utterly forlorn. She wished some help would come from the outside, but in the whole world there was no help. Society was terrible because it was insane. Civilized society is insane. Money and so-called love are its two great manias. Money, a long way first. The individual asserts himself in his disconnected insanity in these two modes: money and love. Look at Michaelis. His life and activity were just insanity. His love was a sort of insanity. And Clifford the same. All that talk, all that writing, all that wild struggling to pull himself forwards. It was just insanity, and it was getting worse, really maniacal. Connie felt washed out with fear, but at least Clifford was shifting his grip from her onto Mrs. Bolton. He did not know it. Like many insane people, his insanity might be measured by the things he was not aware of, the great desert tracts in his consciousness. Mrs. Bolton was admirable in many ways, but she had that queer sort of bossiness, endless assertion of her own will, which is one of the signs of insanity in modern woman. She thought she was utterly subservient and living for others. Clifford fascinated her because he always, or so often, frustrated her will, as if by a finer instinct. He had a finer, subtler will of self-assertion than herself. This was his charm for her. Perhaps that had been his charm, too, for Connie. "It's a lovely day today," Mrs. Bolton would say in her caressive, persuasive voice. "I should think you'd enjoy a little run in your chair today. The sun's just lovely." "Yes, will you give me that book there, that yellow one? And I think I'll have those hyacinths taken out." "Why, they're so beautiful," she pronounced it with the Y sound, beautiful, "and the scent is simply gorgeous." "The scent is what I object to," he said. "It's a little funereal." "Do you think so?" she exclaimed in surprise, just a little offended, but impressed. And she carried the hyacinths out of the room, impressed by his higher fastidiousness. "Shall I shave you this morning, or would you rather do it yourself?" Always the same soft, caressive, subservient yet managing voice. "I don't know. Do you mind waiting a while? I'll ring when I'm ready." "Very good, Sir Clifford," she replied, so soft and submissive, withdrawing quietly, but every rebuff stored up new energy of will in her. When he rang, after a time, she would appear at once, and then he would say, "I think I'd rather you shaved me this morning." Her heart gave a little thrill, and she replied with extra softness, "Very good, Sir Clifford." She was very deft, with a soft, lingering touch, a little slow. At first he had resented the infinitely soft touch of her fingers on his face, but now he liked it with a growing voluptuousness. He let her shave him nearly every day. Her face near his, her eyes so very concentrated, watching that she did it right. And gradually her fingertips knew his cheeks and lips, his jaw and chin and throat perfectly. He was well-fed and well-liking. His face and throat were handsome enough, and he was a gentleman. She was handsome, too, pale, her face rather long and absolutely still, her eyes bright, but revealing nothing. Gradually, with infinite softness, almost with love, she was getting him by the throat, and he was yielding to her. She now did almost everything for him, and he felt more at home with her, less ashamed of accepting her menial offices than with Connie. She liked handling him. She loved having his body in her charge, absolutely, to the last menial offices. She said to Connie one day, "All men are babies. When you come to the bottom of them, why, I've handled some of the toughest customers as ever went down Tevershall Pit. But let anything ail them so that you have to do for them, and they're babies. Just big babies. Oh, there's not much difference in men." At first, Mrs. Bolton had thought there really was something different in a gentleman, a real gentleman, like Sir Clifford. So Clifford had got a good start of her. But gradually, as she came to the bottom of him, to use her own term, she found he was like the rest, a baby grown to man's proportions, but a baby with a queer temper and a fine manner and power in its control, and all sorts of odd knowledge that she had never dreamed of, with which he could still bully her. Connie was sometimes tempted to say to him, "For God's sake, don't sink so horribly into the hands of that woman." But she found she didn't care for him enough to say it in the long run. It was still their habit to spend the evening together till 10 o'clock. Then they would talk or read together or go over his manuscript, but the thrill had gone out of it. She was bored by his manuscripts, but she still dutifully typed them out for him. But in time, Mrs. Bolton would do even that. For Connie had suggested to Mrs. Bolton that she should learn to use a typewriter, and Mrs. Bolton, always ready, had begun at once, and practiced assiduously. So now Clifford would sometimes dictate a letter to her, and she would take it down rather slowly but correctly. And he was very patient, spelling for her the difficult words or the occasional phrases in French. She was so thrilled, it was almost a pleasure to instruct her. Now, Connie would sometimes plead a headache as an excuse for going up to her room after dinner. "Perhaps Mrs. Bolton will play piquet with you," she said to Clifford. "Oh, I shall be perfectly all right. You go to your own room and rest, darling." But no sooner had she gone than he rang for Mrs. Bolton and asked her to take a hand at piquet, or bézique, or even chess. He had taught her all these games, and Connie found it curiously objectionable to see Mrs. Bolton flushed and tremulous like a little girl, touching her queen or her knight with uncertain fingers, then drawing away again, and Clifford, faintly smiling with a half-teasing superiority, saying to her, "You must say, j'adube." She looked up at him with bright, startled eyes, then murmured shyly, obediently, "J'adube." Yes, he was educating her, and he enjoyed it. It gave him a sense of power. And she was thrilled. She was coming bit by bit into possession of all that the gentry knew, all that made them upper class, apart from the money. That thrilled her, and at the same time she was making him want to have her there with him. It was a subtle, deep flattery to him, her genuine thrill. To Connie, Clifford seemed to be coming out in his true colors, a little vulgar, a little common, and uninspired, rather fat. Ivy Bolton's tricks and humble bossiness were also only too transparent. But Connie did wonder at the genuine thrill which the woman got out of Clifford. To say she was in love with him would be putting it wrongly. She was thrilled by her contact with a man of the upper class, this titled gentleman, this author who could write books and poems and whose photograph appeared in the illustrated newspapers. She was thrilled to a weird passion, and his educating her roused in her a passion of excitement and response much deeper than any love affair could have done. In truth, the very fact that there could be no love affair left her free to thrill to her very marrow with this other passion, the particular passion of knowing. Knowing as he knew. There was no mistake that the woman was in some way in love with him, whatever force we give to the word love. She looked so handsome and so young, and her gray eyes were sometimes marvelous. At the same time, there was a lurking, soft satisfaction about her, even of triumph and private satisfaction. Ugh, that private satisfaction. How Connie loathed it. But no wonder Clifford was caught by the woman. She absolutely adored him in her persistent fashion and put herself absolutely at his service, for him to use as he liked. No wonder he was flattered. Connie heard long conversations going on between the two, or rather it was mostly Mrs. Bolton talking. She had unloosed to him the stream of gossip about Tevershall village. It was more than gossip. It was Mrs. Gaskell and George Eliot and Mrs. Mitford all rolled in one, with a great deal more that these women left out. Once started, Mrs. Bolton was better than any book about the lives of the people. She knew them all so intimately, and had such a peculiar, flamy zest in all their affairs. It was wonderful, if just a trifle humiliating, to listen to her. At first, she had not ventured to talk Tevershall, as she called it, to Clifford, but once started, it went on. Clifford was listening for material, and he found in it plenty. Connie realized that his so-called genius was just this, a perspicuous talent for personal gossip, clever and apparently detached. Mrs. Bolton, of course, was very warm when she talked Tevershall. Carried away, in fact. And it was marvelous, the things that happened and that she knew about. She would have run to dozens of volumes. Connie was fascinated listening to her, but afterwards always a little ashamed. She ought not to listen with this queer, rabid curiosity. After all, one may hear the most private affairs of other people, but only in a spirit of respect for the struggling, battered thing which any human soul is, and in a spirit of fine, discriminative sympathy. For even satire is a form of sympathy. It is the way our sympathy flows and recoils that really determines our lives. And here lies the vast importance of the novel properly handled. It can inform and lead into new places the flow of our sympathetic consciousness, and it can lead our sympathy away in recoil from things gone dead. Therefore, the novel, properly handled, can reveal the most secret places of life, for it is in the passional secret places of life, above all, that the tide of sensitive awareness needs to ebb and flow, cleansing and refreshing. But the novel, like gossip, can also excite spurious sympathies and recoils, mechanical and deadening to the psyche. The novel can glorify the most corrupt feelings so long as they are conventionally pure. Then the novel, like gossip, becomes at last vicious, and, like gossip, all the more vicious because it is always ostensibly on the side of the angels. Mrs. Bolton's gossip was always on the side of the angels. And he was such a bad fellow, and she was such a nice woman. Whereas, as Connie could see even from Mrs. Bolton's gossip, the woman had been merely a mealy-mouthed sort, and the man angrily honest. But angry honesty made a bad man of him, and mealy-mouthedness made a nice woman of her, in the vicious, conventional channeling of sympathy by Mrs. Bolton. For this reason, the gossip was humiliating, and for the same reason most novels, especially popular ones, are humiliating too. The public responds now only to an appeal to its vices. Nevertheless, one got a new vision of Tevershall village from Mrs. Bolton's talk. A terrible, seething welter of ugly life it seemed, not at all the flat drabness it looked from outside. Clifford, of course, knew by sight most of the people mentioned. Connie knew only one or two, but it sounded really more like a Central African jungle than an English village. "I suppose you heard as Miss Alsop was married last week, would you ever? Miss Alsop, old James's daughter, the boot and shoe Alsop. You know, they built a house up at Pye Croft. The old man died last year from a fall. 83 he was, and nimble as a lad, and then he slipped on Bestwood Hill on a slide as the lads had made last winter and broke his thigh. And that finished him, poor old man. It did seem a shame. Well, he left all his money to Tatty. Didn't give the boys a penny, and Tatty, I know, is 5 years. Yes, she's 53 last autumn. And you know, they were such chapel people, my word. She taught Sunday school for 30 years till her father died. And then she started carrying on with a fellow from Kinbrook. I don't know if you know him. An oldish fellow with a red nose, rather dandified. Wilcock, as works in Harrison's wood yard. Well, He's 65 if he's a day. Yet you'd have thought they were a pair of young turtle doves to see 'em arm in arm and kissing at the gate. Yes, and she's sitting on his knee right in the bay window on Pycroft Road for anybody to see. And he's got sons over 40. Only lost his wife 2 years ago. If old James Alsop hasn't risen from his grave, it's because there is no rising, for he kept her that strict. Now they're married and gone to live down at Kinbrook, and they say she goes round in a dressing-gown from morning to night, a veritable sight. I'm sure it's awful, the way the old ones go on. Why, they're a lot worse than the young, and a sight more disgusting. I lay it down to the pictures myself, but you can't keep them away. I was always saying, go to a good, instructive film, but do, for goodness sake, keep away from these melodramas and love films. Anyhow, keep the children away. But there you are. Grown-ups are worse than the children, and the old ones beat the band. Talk about morality. Nobody cares a thing. Folks does as they like, and much better off they are for it, I must say. But they're having to draw their horns in nowadays, now the pits are working so bad and they haven't got the money. And the grumbling they do, it's awful, especially the women. The men are so good and patient. What can they do, poor chaps, but the women, oh, they do carry on. They go and show off, giving contributions for a wedding present for Princess Mary, and then, when they see all the grand things that's been given, they simply rave. Who's she? Any better than anybody else? Why doesn't Swan and Edgar give me 1 fur coat instead of giving her 6? I wish I'd kept my 10 shillings. What's she going to give me, I should like to know? Here I can't get a new spring coat. My dad's working that bad. And she gets van loads. It's time as poor folks had some money to spend. Rich ones is at it long enough. I want a new spring coat, I do, and where am I going to get it? I say to them, be thankful you're well fed and well clothed, without all the new finery you want. And they fly back at me, why isn't Princess Mary thankful to go about in her old rags then, and have nothing? Folks like her get van loads, and I can't have a new spring coat. It's a damned shame. Princess. Bloomin' rot about Princess. It's money as matters, and 'cause she's got lots they give her more. Nobody's given me any, and I've as much right as anybody else. Don't talk to me about education, it's money as matters. I want a new spring coat, I do, and I shan't get it, 'cause there's no money. That's all they care about, clothes. They think nothing of giving 7 or 8 guineas for a winter coat, colliers' daughters, mind you, and 2 guineas for a child's summer hat. And then they go to the primitive chapel in their 2-guinea hat, girls as would have been proud of a 3 and 6-penny one in my day. I heard that at the Primitive Methodist anniversary this year, when they have a built-up platform for the Sunday school children, like a grandstand, going almost up to the ceiling, I heard Miss Thompson, who has the first class of girls in the Sunday school, say there'd be over £1,000 in new Sunday clothes sitting on that platform. And times are what they are, but you can't stop them. They're mad for clothes, and the boys the same. The lads spend every penny on themselves, clothes, smoking, drinking in the miners' welfare, jaunting off to Sheffield 2 or 3 times a week. Why, it's another world. And they fear nothing, and they respect nothing, the young don't. The older men are that patient and good, really. They let the women take everything. And this is what it leads to. The women are positive demons. But the lads aren't like their dads. They're sacrificing nothing, they aren't. They're all for self. If you tell them they ought to be putting a bit by for a home, they say, that'll keep, that will. I'm going to enjoy myself while I can. How else'll keep? Oh, they're rough and selfish, if you like. Everything falls on the older men. And it's a bad outlook all around. Clifford began to get a new idea of his own village. The place had always frightened him, but he had thought it more or less stable. Now, is there much socialism, Bolshevism among the people? He asked. Oh, said Mrs. Bolton, you hear a few loud-mouthed ones, but they're mostly women who've got into debt. The men take no notice. I don't believe you'll ever turn our Teversham men into Reds. They're too decent for that. But the young ones blether sometimes. Not that they care for it, really. They only want a bit of money in their pocket to spend at the welfare or go gadding to Sheffield. That's all they care. When they've got no money, they'll listen to the Reds spouting. But nobody believes in it, really. So you think there's no danger? Oh, no, not if trade was good, there wouldn't be. But if things were bad for a long spell, the young ones might go funny. I tell you, they're a selfish, spoilt lot. But I don't see how they'd ever do anything. They aren't ever serious about anything except showing off on motorbikes and dancing at the Palais de Danse in Sheffield. You can't make them serious. The serious ones dress up in evening clothes and go off to the Palais to show off before a lot of girls and dance these new Charlestons and what-not. I'm sure sometimes the bus'll be full of young fellows in evening suits, collier lads, off to the Palais, let alone those that have gone with their girls in motors or on motorbikes. They don't give a serious thought to a thing, save Doncaster races and the Derby, for they all of them bet on every race. And football. But even football's not what it was, not by a long chalk. It's too much like hard work, they say. No, they'd rather be off on motorbikes to Sheffield or Nottingham Saturday afternoons. But what do they do when they get there? Oh, hang around and have some tea in some fine tea place like the Mikado, and then go to the Palais or the Pictures or the Empire with some girl. The girls are as free as the lads. They do just what they like. And what do they do when they haven't the money for these things? They seem to get it somehow, and they begin talking nasty then, but I don't see how you're going to get Bolshevism when all the lads want is just money to enjoy themselves, and the girls the same with fine clothes. And they don't care about another thing. They haven't the brains to be socialist. They haven't enough seriousness to take anything really serious, and they never will have. Connie thought how extremely like all the rest of the classes, the lower classes, sounded. Just the same thing over again. Teversham or Mayfair or Kensington. There was only one class nowadays, money boys. The money boy and the money girl. The only difference was how much you'd got and how much you wanted. Under Mrs. Bolton's influence, Clifford began to take a new interest in the mines. He began to feel he belonged. A new sort of self-assertion came into him. After all, he was the real boss in Teversham. He was really the Pitts. It was a new sense of power, something he had till now shrunk from with dread. Teversham pits were running thin. There were only 2 collieries, Teversham itself and New London. Teversham had once been a famous mine and had made famous money, but its best days were over. New London was never very rich, and in ordinary times just got along decently, but now times were bad, and it was pits like New London that got left. There's a lot of Teversham men left and gone to Stacksgate and Whiteover, said Mrs. Bolton. You've not seen the new works at Stacksgate, opened after the war, have you, Sir Clifford? Oh, you must go one day. There's something quite new. Great big chemical works at the pit head. Doesn't look a bit like a colliery. They say they get more money out of the chemical byproducts than out of the coal. I forget what it is. and the grand new houses for the men, fair mansions. Of course, it's bought a lot of riffraff from all over the country. But a lot of Tevershall men got on there, and doing well, a lot better than our own men. They say Tevershall's done, finished. Only a question of a few more years, and it'll have to shut down. And New London'll go first. My word, won't it be funny when there's no Tevershall pit working? It's bad enough during a strike, but my word, if it closes for good, it'll be like the end of the world. Even when I was a girl, it was the best pit in the country, and a man counted himself lucky if he could get on there. Oh, there's been some money made in Tevershall, and now the men say it's a sinking ship, and it's time they all got out. Doesn't it sound awful? But of course, there's a lot as'll never go till they have to. They don't like these new-fangled mines, such a depth and all machinery to work them. Some of them simply dreads those iron men, as they call them, those machines for hewing the coal, where men always did it before. And they say it's wasteful as well, but what goes in waste is saved in wages and a lot more. It seems soon there'll be no use for men on the face of the earth. It'll be all machines, but they say that's what folks said when they had to give up the old stocking frames. I can remember one or two, but my word, the more machines, the more people. That's what it looks like. They say you can't get the same chemicals out of Tevershall coal as you can out of Stack's Gate. And that's funny. They're not 3 miles apart. But they say so. But everybody says it's a shame something can't be started to keep the men going a bit better and employ the girls. All the girls traipsing off to Sheffield every day. My word, it would be something to talk about if Tevershall collieries took a new lease of life, after everybody saying they're finished, and a sinking ship, and the men ought to leave them like rats leaving a sinking ship. But folks talk so much. Of course there was a boom during the war, when Sir Geoffrey made a trust of himself and got the money safe forever somehow, so they say. But they say even the masters and the owners don't get much out of it now. You can hardly believe it, can you? Why, I always thought the pits would go on for ever and ever. Who'd have thought when I was a girl? But New England's shut down, so is Colwick Wood. Yes, it's fair haunting to go through that copy and see Colwick Wood standing there deserted among the trees, and bushes growing up all over the pit head, and the lines red rusty. It's like death itself, a dead colliery. Why, whatever should we do if Tevershall shut down? It doesn't bear thinking of, always that throng it's been except at strikes, and even then the fan wheels don't stand, except when they fetched the ponies up. I'm sure it's a funny world. You don't know where you are from year to year. You really don't. It was Mrs. Bolton's talk that really put a new fight into Clifford. His income, as she pointed out to him, was secure from his father's trust, even though it was not large. The pits did not really concern him. It was the other world he wanted to capture, the world of literature and fame, the popular world, not the working world. Now he realized the distinction between popular success and working success, the populace of pleasure and the populace of work. He, as a private individual, had been catering with his stories for the populace of pleasure, and he had caught on. But beneath the populace of pleasure lay the populace of work, grim, grimy, and rather terrible. They, too, had to have their providers, and it was a much grimmer business providing for the populace of work than for the populace of pleasure. While he was doing his stories and getting on in the world, Tevershall was going to the wall. He realized now that the bitch goddess of success had 2 main appetites, one for flattery, adulation, stroking, and tickling such as writers and artists gave her, but the other a grimmer appetite for meat and bones. and the meat and bones for the bitch goddess were provided by the men who made money in industry. Yes, there were two great groups of dogs wrangling for the bitch goddess, the group of the flatterers, those who offered her amusement, stories, films, plays, and the other, much less showy, much more savage breed, those who gave her meat, the real substance of money. The well-groomed, showy dogs of amusement wrangled and snarled among themselves for the favors of the bitch goddess, but it was nothing to the silent fight to the death that went on among the indispensables, the bone-bringers. But under Mrs. Bolton's influence, Clifford was tempted to enter this other fight, to capture the bitch goddess by brute means of industrial production. Somehow, he got his pecker up. In one way, Mrs. Bolton made a man of him, as Connie never did. Connie kept him apart and made him sensitive and conscious of himself and his own states. Mrs. Bolton made hint aware only of outside things. Inwardly, he began to go soft as pulp. But outwardly, he began to be effective. He even roused himself to go to the mines once more, and when he was there he went down in a tub, and in a tub he was hauled out into the workings. Things he had learned before the war, and seemed utterly to have forgotten, now came back to him. He sat there, crippled, in a tub, with the underground manager showing him the seam with a powerful torch. And he said little, but his mind began to work. He began to read again his technical works on the coal mining industry. He studied the government reports, and he read with care the latest things on mining and the chemistry of coal and of shale, which were written in German. Of course, the most valuable discoveries were kept secret as far as possible, but once you started a sort of research in the field of coal mining, a study of methods and means, a study of byproducts and the chemical possibilities of coal, it was astounding, the ingenuity and the almost uncanny cleverness of the modern technical mind, as if really the devil himself had lent fiends' wits to the technical scientists of industry. It was far more interesting than art, than literature. Poor, emotional, half-witted stuff was this technical science of industry. In this field, men were like gods or demons, inspired to discoveries and fighting to carry them out. In this activity, men were beyond any mental age calculable. But Clifford knew that when it did come to the emotional and human life, these self-made men were of a mental age of about 13. Feeble boys. The discrepancy was enormous and appalling. But let that be. Let man slide down to general idiocy in the emotional and human mind. Clifford did not care. Let all that go hang. He was interested in the technicalities of modern coal mining and in pulling Tevershall out of the hole. He went down to the pit day after day. He studied. He put the general manager and the overhead manager and the underground manager and the engineers through a mill they had never dreamed of. Power. He felt a new sense of power flowing through him, power over all these men, over the hundreds and hundreds of colliers. He was finding out, and he was getting things into his grip. And he seemed verily to be reborn. Now life came into him. Now life came into him. He had been gradually dying with Connie in the isolated private life of the artist and the conscious being. Now let all that go. Let it sleep. He simply felt life rush into him out of the coal, out of the pit. The very stale air of the colliery was better than oxygen to him. It gave him a sense of power. Power. He was doing something, and he was going to do something. He was going to win, not as he had won with his stories, mere publicity amid a whole sapping of energy and malice, but a man's victory. At first, he thought the solution lay in electricity. Convert the coal into electric power. Then a new idea came. The Germans invented a new locomotive engine with a self-feeder that did not need a fireman. And it was to be fed with a new fuel that burnt in small quantities at a great heat under peculiar conditions. The idea of a new concentrated fuel that burnt with a hard slowness at a fierce heat was what first attracted Clifford. There must be some sort of external stimulus to the burning of such fuel, not merely air supply. He began to experiment, and got a clever young fellow who had proved brilliant in chemistry to help him. And he felt triumphant. He had at last got out of himself. He had fulfilled his lifelong secret yearning to get out of himself. Art had not done it for him. Art had only made it worse. But now he had done it. He was not aware how much Mrs. Bolton was behind him. He did not know how much he depended on her. But for all that, it was evident that when he was with her, his voice dropped to an easy rhythm of intimacy, almost a trifle vulgar. With Connie he was a little stiff. He felt he owed her everything, and he showed her the utmost respect and consideration, so long as she gave him mere outward respect. But it was obvious he had a secret dread of her. The new Achilles in Hint had a heel, and in this heel the woman like Connie, his wife, could lame him fatally. He went in a certain half-subservient dread of her, and was extremely nice to her, but his voice was a little tense when he spoke to her, and he began to be silent whenever she was present. But his voice was a little tense when he spoke to her, and he began to be silent whenever she was present. Only when he was alone with Mrs. Bolton did he really feel a lord and a master, and his voice ran on with her almost as easily and garrulously as her own could run, and he let her shave him or sponge all his body as if he were a child. Really, as if he were a child.